understand, say, our heart as you apply your lives, share. Bless us.
All right. We're continuing with the life of Moses, and we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 6. That's where we'll start off tonight. And so where we're at in this encounter, and we've entitled the series, The Promise of God's Presence, because that was the overriding factor that kind of stuck with Moses. The overriding promise that stuck with Moses throughout his entire ministry, throughout the entire wilderness wanderings, and the whiny Israelites that he had to put up with. And throughout the whole thing, God was faithful to his promise. He said, I will be with you. He promised him that. And so tonight we're going to look at the second encounter that Moses and Aaron have with Pharaoh. Last week we saw the first encounter, and that didn't go so well. Pharaoh, they said, we have a message from our God, and the message is to let my people go. And Pharaoh said, I'm not going to let them go, and instead I'm going to make their work harder. I'm going to make their life more miserable and everything more difficult for them. And so the Israelites' response to that was attacking Moses and his brother Aaron. So they lashed out at them and essentially cursed them. May God judge you for what's happened to us. And so they were kind of, that was anger that was displaced, because Moses was not the cause of their suffering. Moses was the one God had sent to deliver them. But we finished up last night by reading the last couple of verses last week. Thank you. Can't make any mistakes around you. Got my back. Thank you. So last week in Exodus 5, the last couple of verses of Exodus 5, the people have just attacked Moses and Aaron, not physically but verbally, and rejected them and their leadership. And we read verses 22 and 23, I think it's the first slide on there. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? We talk about asking God tough questions, bringing those tough situations to God. Why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak your name, he has done harm to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. So the first encounter with Pharaoh was not a positive experience for anyone, unless maybe Pharaoh, maybe he got some thrill out of it. Tonight we're going to see that the second encounter they have with Pharaoh. And so we're looking at this encounter with Pharaoh. The first thing we're going to see is God's going to address the fact that he is in control. God's in control. So let's turn over to the next verse in Exodus chapter 6. Exodus 6, verse 1. Then the Lord. So this is an unfortunate place for a chapter break, because this conversation here is a direct follow-up to what I just read. Those tough questions Moses had, those difficult circumstances, like, God, you brought me here to do this, and since I got here, you haven't done anything, and this dilemma that he's facing. And so chapter 6, verse 1 is a direct continuation of that. There was no break. There was no, okay, let's pause and next day or something. No, it was a direct continuation. Then the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. For under compulsion he will let them go, and under compulsion he will drive them out of his land. God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan for the land in which they sojourn. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because of because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgment. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for possession. I am the Lord. So God tells Moses in verse 1, he says, now you will see. That's how God starts his response to Moses. To Moses challenging questions, to Moses almost accusing God of not following through on what he promised to do. He starts off by saying, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. So the waiting is over, the preparation has been done, the groundwork is laid, and in response to Moses' doubt, God speaks decisively. He says, now is the time. And here's three things that kind of are part of what God tells Moses in this conversation here. He tells three really important things. First thing we need to understand, God is God. He's God even over Pharaoh. If you look at verse 1, he says, I will compel Pharaoh. I will, under compulsion, he will let you leave. I will compel him to do that. Essentially, God's going to say, I'm going to make life so miserable on him. He's going to think it's his idea, but it's really my idea. That's what it means. I'm going to make things horrible for him. That's the compulsion he's driven me to by his lack of response, by his unwillingness to listen. It's going to be in his own best interest to do what we've already suggested. He can do it the easy way, or he can do it the hard way. Pharaoh chose the hard way, right? So God is God even over Pharaoh. So under compulsion, and he said, Pharaoh will let them go. So God's in control of Pharaoh. He knows what Pharaoh's going to do. Pharaoh's going to let you go. Not only is he going to let you go, if you look at verse 1, it says, he will drive you out of the land. Right now, he would fight to keep you to stay. But when I'm done with him, he's going to force you out of the land. He's going to chase you. Second thing, so God is God even over Pharaoh. Second thing God tells him and makes clear is that this is God's people, and he hears them. 4 times in this section that we just read, 4 times God says, I am the Lord. I am the Lord. He hears them, is what he's telling them. He's remembered them. He's never forgotten them. He says, I remember my covenant with them. Now, we talked about that several weeks ago, and just for a refresher, when God says he remembers his promise, or he remembers his people, or he remembers his covenant, it's not because God forgot. It's because God's getting ready to take action. It's not because it has slipped his mind. It's because what do we do when we remember something? I gave the illustration, I procrastinate even more. I forgot about my scrumptious cinnamon crunch bagel in the toaster. And it was going and going, or is in the oven under the broiler, and I didn't want it to burn. And I remembered my bagel, and I sprinted across the house because I remembered. And so, what was my resulting action? I took immediate action. What does God do when it says He remembers? Not that He forgot, but He is taking action. He's taking action. This is the God who made the covenant. This whole covenant wasn't people said, God, will you promise to give us a land and make us a great nation? And can you do some things? We have some requests of you. No, this was all God's idea. He's the one that made the covenant, and He's the one that's keeping that covenant. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, in verse 3, there's kind of a weird phrasing of things here. It says, they knew my name as Almighty, but my name Lord I did not make. But by my name Lord I did not make myself known to you. Like, is he? What's going on here? How's it different? What's going on? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that generation knew God in relationship to the covenant as the God who makes the covenant. This God who promised us this land and this nation. Your generation, Moses, will know me differently. You're going to know me as the God who keeps that covenant, who takes action and brings it to fulfillment, who brings you physically to the land, and it will be your land. You will no longer be sojourners in that land. You will no longer just be traveling through. It will be your land. So the third thing we see is God's God even over Pharaoh. This is God's people. He hears them. And these are the things that God will do. If you look at verses 7 and 8, if you have those available in your Bible, you see 7 different statements from God. That he says, I will do this. I forgot to make a slide for this, but they're in your Bible, so that's cool. First thing he says, seven different I will statements that God makes in these couple verses. I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. There's going to be no more bricks, no more searching for straw, no more slave masters, no more beatings. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Second one, I will deliver you from their bondage. You will no longer be a slave. You've been a slave your whole life. Your parents were slaves. Your grandparents were slaves. You've been slaves here for most of 400 years. You will no longer be slaves. I will deliver you from bondage. I will also redeem you. I will redeem you. Basically, God will bring his judgment on Egypt. You remember part of what God promised Abraham? He said, those who bless you, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. Where do you think Pharaoh and the Egyptians fall in that spectrum? Do you think they're in for a blessing or are they in for a cursing?
Latter.
They're not in for a good few months ahead of them, are they? He's going to bring his judgment on Egypt and bring redemption. Through that, bring redemption and freedom for Israel. Fourth I will, Jesus says here, I will take you for my people. I will take you for my people. You're no longer going to be known as the slaves of Egypt. You will be my people. You will be children of. You will no longer be known as the people of Egypt, the people of the land. Number 5, I will be your God. Follow along, you can find all these in there. I will be your God. I'm not just a God like they have in Egypt. They have many gods, multiple gods. I'm not just a God. I'm not just the God. I am your God. He is the only God, but he brings it to a personal one. I am your God. I am the God who hears you. Remember, I've heard your cries. I've heard your groanings. I've seen your affliction. I am your God. I will be your God. They won't just know about God. Okay. Number 6, I will bring you to the land. This is the land that was promised so many generations ago, hundreds of years earlier. God made that promise. Abram, I'm going to bring you to the land I will give you. I will show you. Then after 400 years, your descendants will come back to their land. That is taking place now. That's what's happening. That's on the spectrum. So no longer is this some pipeline dream that people have talked about. They've heard previous generations talk about. they are seeing God take that action. I will bring you to the land. I will give it to you for a possession. As I mentioned, the patriarchs lived there. Abraham had his tent set up there, and he raised his flocks and stuff there. Isaac and Jacob, they lived there. They raised their families, everything there. But it was never their land. They were just passing through. They were just setting up a tent on some, on some land that no one really was using at the time. And so they just kind of were setting up camp as needed. But he says, I will give this land to you for possession. Now it will be your land. So the Israelites obviously have to be thrilled by this revelation, right? So let's look at verse 9. So Moses said this to the sons of Israel. They were not thrilled. But they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and the cruel bondage. What are they focused on in this moment? Themselves, the circumstances. They're missing this amazing revelation from God because Moses goes and shares it with them. And they miss it because they're focused on their circumstances. God shows them his character. He gives them his promises, and they miss it because they're focused on themselves and what's going on in their life. You ever find that's true in your life? Let's do it this way. Maybe some of you have a friend who's done that, right? Focus on the circumstances in your life and miss what God is doing. What's up, your
I think like the Israelites are like, look, dude, you said this before, and our lives just got worse. It's like, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us.
Yeah. So
they're tuned out on it.
Yeah, they're definitely tuned out on it. But they have something more than the word of Moses. They have the word of God. And where are we going to put our faith? And that's the challenge here. So when we get focused on circumstances, so let's go back to your friend who sometimes does that. Your friend gets focused on the circumstances. They get focused, the lose sight of what God's doing, who God is, because they're so focused on the things that are overwhelming them at the moment. What would you tell them? What are some things that you would tell them? And here's what I would challenge you to do. Think through that. What would I tell that friend? I care about them. I want them to be able to come through this with a right perspective of God. Write those things down somewhere that you can find them, because you're going to be in that position at some point where you lose sight of who God is because of the circumstances around you. That's what they've done. So the first thing is God's demonstration that he's in control. Second part of this section is that God confirms his selection of Moses and Aaron. And you're going to see Aaron be a part of what's going on now. Why is that? Because of Moses' reluctance to just take a step of faith and do as God has told him. So he's kind of keeping his... As you read through this, you almost get tired of hearing Moses complain about how bad he is at speaking and how people won't listen to him. It's like,
he's very
really
insecure.
Are you going to say that again? Let's flip flop that. How does God feel about our complaining? Because how did God deal with Moses? Patiently. He directed him. He corrected him. He gave him provision. How does God deal with our complaining? Because it's easy to point the finger at Moses. It's easy to be like, what a loser. Those Israelites, what whiners. Good thing we never whine. So God confirms his selection of Moses. So here's one thing we have to keep in mind. In this section, there's not a long genealogy, but there is a genealogy here. And we have to keep in mind who the primary audience was. Anybody know who wrote Exodus?
Moses
Moses did, yeah. And so Moses wrote it before they entered the promised land. He made a record of everything from creation up until their wilderness wanderings. And he wrote that all down, including the law and all the regulations and everything that God had given him to tell them. And he had written all that down. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses had written all that down for them as they were going into the land, so that as they entered the land, they would have a record of God's faithfulness, of God's creation, of God's deliverance, of God's plan from point A to point, wherever they ended up. God had a plan from the beginning, and that's what we see here in this genealogy that's taking place here. It kind of takes us out of the storyline and out of the conversation, and gives us a little bigger picture. This gives us the direct line, and if you read through it, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but if you read through it, you see this line of genealogy. It goes from Jacob, and it gets down to Moses and Aaron's generation. Then it follows down to Aaron's grandson. So it goes several generations. And it puts Moses and Aaron right in the middle of that. I think what God is doing is He's showing the continuation of His work, even from the days He first made that promise and passed it on from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Israel. His work started then, and it's not like He's been making it up as He went along. He's had a plan the whole time. And you see this genealogy traced down through. And God's selection of Moses and Aaron right smack dab in the midst of this genealogy was not arbitrary. So those people 40 years after these events are happening, are able to look at this and they read these verses and they read what's going on. And it's like, God did choose. He knew what He was doing when He put Aaron and Moses in charge. He knew what He was doing. He had a plan from the beginning. And they came through. And they followed God's leading. Look at verse 26. So as that concludes, that genealogy concludes, again, Moses and Aaron are kind of smack dab in the middle of that. There's generations before them, generations after them, and it's kind of spotlights them as God's chosen. It was the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, "Bring out the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt according to their host." They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the sons of Israel from Egypt. It was the same Moses and Aaron. So again, just clarifying that before we start this whole Exodus thing, before we start leaving the land, I just want to make sure you understand that the man at the front of the line, that was God's choice. He was the one God selected, and it wasn't an arbitrary selection. It selected him very carefully. God's wisdom extends way beyond the circumstances. We look at circumstances, and we're like, okay, given this and that, this might be a wise decision. And that's a good way to make decisions. We kind of look at the biggest picture we can. God's picture is way bigger. We look at circumstances and short little bit of history. God's looking at generations. God's looking at the overview of all human history,
which are just minutes now.
And He sees it all as one. And so His wisdom extends beyond, and He's demonstrating, I knew what I was doing when I picked Moses, Abraham, and Aaron. It's interesting because this genealogy goes back before slavery even began. Even before you were slaves, I had the lineup of who was going to deliver you from slavery. How cool is that? So God confirms His selection of Moses and Aaron. Next thing is that Aaron is going to be the one to speak to Pharaoh. Look at verse 28. Now it came about on the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, and thus the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I am the Lord. Speak to Pharaoh of Egypt, that I may speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that I all that I speak to you. But Moses said before the Lord, here he goes again, I am unskilled in speech. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? Jumping down to chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. So this isn't some divine anointing kind of thing. This is the kind of role you will have. You will be the authority in this conversation. You will be my spokesman. You will be as God to Pharaoh. Aaron will be the spokesman. That's what a prophet does. He speaks for God. He speaks on behalf of God. So what's God's instruction? Speak all that I speak to you. Speak all that I speak to you. That's a good recommendation. Because our opinions and our perspectives don't always have the power, wisdom. Is what God says to us. Most encouraging thing I can do for someone if they're going through a difficult time is not my experience and my story and my wisdom. It's God's truth. Because there's power. There's wisdom, God's truth. So continuing on, let's jump down to verse 4. So, God says, when Pharaoh does not listen to you, God's setting the stage for this conversation that's about to take place again. When he does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my host, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt, by great judgments. That's not a good place to be in if you're Pharaoh. What's his choice? He doesn't listen. What's the response? God's judgment. God's judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt, and I will bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. So what are Moses' two concerns here? What's his first concern that he mentioned earlier? I don't speak very well.
I'm not charismatic.
I'm unskilled in speech. How did God counter that? I'll give you the words. You say what I tell you to say. You don't even have to be creative here. You just say what I tell you to say. Well, what if, second objection, what if Pharaoh won't listen to me?
He's not.
And that's basically the answer. He won't.
Don't worry about it.
Not your job. Not your concern. I'm calling you to be faithful, not to make him listen. God's about to bring 10 plagues of judgment on Egypt. And through the judgment, he's going to accomplish two things. One, he's going to show the people of Egypt that he is the only God. He says, the Egyptians shall know, verse 5, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. They may not surrender their lives to me. They may not turn their hearts toward me, but they will know without a doubt that I am the Lord, because these judgments will demonstrate who I am. Second thing, he'll show his judgment to the people of Egypt, or he'll show the people of Egypt that he's the only God. And then secondly, he's going to bring Israel out of the land using these judgments. So last little section we're going to look at is Pharaoh rejects God's warning, just as promised, just as you knew, just as you heard in Sunday school. Right? Let's start in verse 10. So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh, and thus they did just as the Lord had commanded. They said what God said to say. They did the things God told them to do, and it didn't work in their favor. It worked out just like God promised, though. He won't listen. As they did just as the Lord had commanded. Aaron threw his staff down before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same with their secret arts. Each one threw down his staff, and they turned into serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staff. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, not listened to them, as the Lord had said. God told you he wasn't going to listen. Yeah, he doesn't. One last sign of God's authority is given to Pharaoh before the judgments start, before he compels him to let the Israelites go. Under compulsion, he will let them go. That's not a good way to do something. Voluntarily is always better, right? Especially if God's the one compelling. So one last sign is given to Pharaoh. The staff becomes a snake, just as God had showed Moses at the burning bush. He said, "What's that in your hand?" Throw it on the ground. It became a snake. He picks it up. It becomes a staff again, showing God's power. Here's an interesting twist on it, though. What happens with pharaohs? They do the same thing.
It's likely that it was an illusion because in snake charming, contrary to popular belief, snakes can in fact hear. It's just not as good as a human. But snakes are able to be trained to stiffen like a staff. And when you throw it down and say whatever magic word, they'll loosen up and slither.
That's one possibility. My perspective is this is demonic.
Also, I may have allowed it to turn into a snake. You let the witch of Endor summon Solomon.
Yeah,
Samuel. I was getting those two. So.
And so, but in allowing that, they're calling on authority outside of human ability. They're calling on demonic authority. Demonic authority is my belief. And I did read, I did read some people who have that kind of perspective that Trey shared as well. We don't know 100% for sure, but he says they do it through their magic arts. And so that's what leads me to believe it's likely demonic influence. But who has the ultimate authority here? Wow, they did the same trick God did. What happened? The staff of Aaron swallowed up all the other staff. No. God has the ultimate power. Their counterfeit power is very low. And it's subservient to God. And he uses that word that it swallowed them up. That word is used twice in the Old Testament, that something was swallowed up like that fashion. This is the first time Aaron's rod, their staff, swallowed up their staff. The second time is a few chapters later in Exodus chapter 15. The Red Sea swallowed up the Egyptians.
I thought you were going to refer to the rebellion of Pharaoh.
No. It's the Red Sea swallowed up the Egyptian army. A sign of God's authority, God's power over nature, God's judgment. God's authority is above all and is eternal. And he gives people, he provides power. He provides authority. He provides positions to people and entities. And he allows that. But his authority is above all. His authority exceeds all. And here's something I hadn't really thought of, what that means in context of just how that plays out, I guess. It's not that God's power is greater than this army. God's power is greater than this leader. And God's power is greater than this demon. And God's power is greater than Satan. God's power is greater than all. You take every bit of power that has ever been given to anyone or any entity or any military, And you combine all of that, and it does not equal the power of God. So it's not that it's, in the movies, the good guy has to fight the bad guys one at a time. And then they're all like, oh, it's taking me forever to get up because that guy hasn't gotten beat up yet. And then he finally gets up, and then he gets beat up, but then the next guy finally is able to get back up because he can beat one of them at a time. That's not God's power. I'm more powerful than you and you and you and you and you. I'm more powerful than all y'all combined. Bring it all at once, and God's power is greater. Pharaoh hasn't learned this yet. He's about to.
Before the surge.
But God's about to demonstrate it to him. And Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh hardens his heart. What does that mean? That his heart is hardened. I think it explains it real simply right there in verse 13. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. What does that mean? He did not listen. And I think you can get real deep and theological about it. But he did not listen. Maybe you know someone that's hard-headed, stubborn. Maybe it's you. Take that stubbornness, that hard-headedness, and put that attitude toward God, put that attitude toward God's truth. That's hard-hearted. That's hardening your heart. So in Exodus 3, we start to see God's call on Moses. And it follows through all the way through this part of chapter 7. So we have several chapters that's devoted to authenticating and describing Moses' qualifications. His main qualification is God chose him. His qualification wasn't that he grew up in Egypt. His qualification wasn't that he was a shepherd for 40 years. His qualification wasn't his ancestry. His qualification was that God called him. He called him to this task. He equipped him for this task. And he confirms that he's going to be with Moses. He gave him the promise of his presence continually. The part of what we want to foster in Refuge is I don't want you just to come here and then go away and just oh, that was cool. Yeah, that was good. I want your life to be changed by the truth we talk about this book. I want your life to be different and you to impact the world around you. That's part of what we have as our mission statement is impacting this generation. Make a difference in the world around you. Ministry isn't just for someone else to do. Don't look around the room and say, oh yeah, that person, they'd be really good. No, you'd be really good at ministry too. And why? Because God has a task for you to do. God wants to use you. So this week, I'm going to challenge you with two things. 2 ministry principles from Moses' life. It's not specific action points, but it's ministry principles that I think you'll see directly related to what we're talking about. First one is remember the God you serve more than the people you serve. Focus on your service to God. And yes, the people are important. So I'm not doing this and saying, I don't care about them. No, not at all. But here's the downside. People can applaud you if you're doing the wrong thing. And if that's your source of affirmation, you're going to keep doing the wrong thing. You're going to keep headed down the wrong road because people are applauding you. People are patting you on the back. On the converse side, I've seen both of these happen in real life. converse side, people can attack you when you're doing the exact right thing. You do the exact thing God tells you to do, and the Israelite leaders come to you and say, may God judge you for doing what you just did. I was just obedient. I don't think he's going to judge me because I just did what he told me to do. But if you're looking at people rather than God, that's going to deflate you. That's going to sidetrack you and make you ineffective in the ministry God's called you to. Do not minister as some minister. So remember God and His perspective. We're not here to please other people. Remember God. Love the people you're working with. Care about them. Invest in them. Pour your heart and life into them. But don't look to them for your affirmation. Don't look to them for your accolades and direction. Focus on what has God called you. Second ministry principle that I hope come to play, you'll be able to put into play and application in your life. Understand that it's God working through you, not you working on behalf of God. I'm here as a spokesman for God. I've got some things I want to bring to you. Now let God work through you. What's the difference in these two perspectives? What's the subtle difference here? One, I'm dependent on myself, my skills. God, here's what I got to offer you. How can I help you? Second one is, actually the first one is, God, I'm available. I don't know how you want it, but I am available. Whatever you want. John 15:5, Jesus said, apart from you, it's all about Him. It's all about Him. It's not about us. That's right. God, thank you for these truths that can apply to our lives for events that were thousands of years. Thank you that you're the same God now that you put that. Same God that spoke to Moses, said, here's what I do. Here's my. God, we can take those truths. I just thank you for this group. I think chance we open chances we go out. Each one of us will have a chance to serve.